the other great philosopher who can be credited with having begun the philosophical revolution and is as influential, if not more, as his Ustad Mohtram, which is Plato. We'll be looking at Aristotle's logic and theory of knowledge. We'll be looking at his theory of ethics very briefly, and finally we'll come to his politics, which is of chief concern and interest to us. There's a lot of slides today, so I'm going to go through the slides somewhat quickly, but of course these slides are also available on LMS and so on. So Aristotle was born in 384 BC, passed away in 322 BC. He was in Stagira in Greece. He wrote about 31 works, and that's really, actually he wrote many more books, but these are the ones that have come down to us. Many of his other works, etc., were really never sort of put together. In all, he wrote more than, they say, more than 1 million words, and this is before word processing, so he wrote it with his hand, which is great. And he formed another great institution, which is called the Lyceum. Just as Plato built the Academy, Aristotle built the Lyceum. And you must have heard of Lahore Lyceum and so on, right? The word. So if Plato built the Academy, Aristotle rivaled it with his Lyceum. And of course it was also very, very influential. I think I spoke about this earlier. He had a very, very close relationship with Plato, was deeply inspired by his work. He joined Plato's Academy at the tender age of 17, and he left it only once Plato died. He was there 20 years, and it's only once Plato was no more that he left it. But when he did, he turned Plato on his head, creating the greatest debate in the history of philosophy. In fact, the debate is so great that some people even say that that is still the only real debate in philosophy. I mean, the whole 2,500 years of the history of philosophy can said to be a debate between Plato and Aristotle. Itna bada iska influence hai. And there's a famous saying, we don't know whether it's true or not, but that Plato, when he discovered that Aristotle didn't subscribe to his views, said something to the extent that Aristotle has kicked me as a colt kicks its mother. But Aristotle replied, Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is the truth. And that's a very famous portrait, Plato pointing upwards towards the ideal forms, towards the sky, and Aristotle pointing downwards to the earth, because that also captures the two very different methodologies that these great philosophers had. Another interesting fact is that Aristotle was the Ustad Mohtram of Alexander the Great, and that's why I often joke that किसी अच्छे उस्ताद की शागिर्दी कर लो, कोई छोटा मोटा पिंड ही conquer कर लोगे कम से कम. So, but after Alexander's death, Aristotle feared for his safety and in fact left Athens. And when he did, he said, I see no reason to permit Athens to sin twice against philosophy. The first time, of course, was Socrates, and the second time would be Aristotle himself. So philosophers at that time often sort of got into trouble with the law, as you can see. Aristotle can also be credited as being the first genuine scientist in history. Plato is much more of a philosopher. It would not really be correct to call him a scientist, but as far as natural science is concerned. But Aristotle is one of the first great scientists of history. And as the Encyclopedia Britannica writes, every scientist in the world, in history, is in his debt. He wrote on botany, on biology, on logic, on music, on mathematics, on astronomy, on medicine, on cosmology, physics, the history of philosophy, metaphysics, psychology, ethics, theology, rhetoric, political history, government and political theory, rhetoric and the arts. And he's regarded as arguably the most influential philosopher of all time. His political ideas were in two books. One is the book on Nicomachean ethics, and the other is politics. So really, he wrote and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote. How did he do it? How could somebody write on so many different topics and actually have broken new ground on each topic that he wrote on? It's not, I mean, people can write on 20 different topics or subjects or whatnot, but the fact is that he discovered new things in every single thing that he wrote about. And they're so diverse, it's incredible. How did he do it? This guy must have been a born genius, or is it in his genes, or what was it about him? Well, the key was in his method of study. Once he devised a method of study, he was then able to apply that methods to all the various subjects that existed and was able to achieve remarkable results in each of them. He really can be credited also with having created the first rules of logical reasoning and logical thought. And also he is the great systematizer and classifier of knowledge. One of the great things he does is he takes whatever exists, all the knowledge that exists, and then he laboriously and meticulously classifies it and divides it and says, oh, this belongs here, this belongs here, and this belongs here. He just organizes knowledge. So he's an incredible organizer. Creator of inventory of terms. In fact, many of the terms, you'll be shocked to discover how many of the terms that we use, both in the natural sciences as well as in the social sciences, were invented, derived, or created by Aristotle himself. So these three great guys, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, really, they are the cornerstones of what we would consider to be Western political philosophy. What was his methodology? Well, his methodology was, first of all, he would start by doing what's called an index, a literature review. And if you know anything about writing for the social sciences, which you should, because, well, you're social science students, that's what we ask you to do in your essays as well. Start with the literature review. Start by studying what other people have written. Then he would boil down that literature into a dialectical debate. What are the two main big camps that exist in all the literature? What is the main question that people are debating? Whether that, if you're looking at democracy, or you're looking at capitalism, or whatever question you're looking at, what are the big dividing lines? What's the big debate at that time? And then, of course, he developed a system of epistemology and a system of logic, and he would pass his, his understanding through that system, and he would achieve remarkable results. So that was his overall method: is to study everybody that exists, classify it, understand the big debates, and then pass them through his method of logic, and achieve remarkable results. So for this purpose, he created certain tools, logical tools, which he calls the organon. These are his books, categories on interpretation, prior analytics, posterior analytics, topics, and sophistical refutations. And these books together, 6 of them, are what we call his tools, his logical tools, his tools through which he really manages to look at everything. He also divides science into 3 interesting categories, and I find them particularly interesting because they say a lot about how the Greeks thought about knowledge and the sciences. First were the theoretical sciences, and what we today call natural sciences would fall into the theoretical sciences. And then there were the practical sciences, and this was politics and ethics and all of what we call humanities and social sciences. And then finally were the productive sciences, what we would call today skills and crafts and what we study at polytechnical institutions. So the interesting thing that it says is, today we consider the sciences to be practical. We say, ye koi asal kaam ho raha hai. And we consider the humanities and social sciences to be theoretical, abstract and airy-fairy, tree-hugging, liberal sort of people who really are not connected with reality. In fact, the Greeks saw it the other way around. The reason why perhaps they saw it the other way around is because sciences themselves, natural sciences themselves, for Aristotle appeared to be theoretical because he didn't really see them as having too much practical value at that particular point in time. Whatever was practical was put into productive sciences anyway, but this is much more abstract understanding of physics, chemistry, and so on and so forth. So what did he write about that? Well, physics was in theoretical sciences. Well, the reason why he called it theoretical was because he believed this was knowledge for its own sake. It wasn't knowledge for the sake of developing some skill or having some productive use of it or developing the economy or something. So physics was in that, generation and corruption on the heavens, metaphysics on the soul, brief natural treatise, history of animals, parts of animals, movement of animals, meteorology, progression of animals, generation of animals. He really enjoyed studying animals as well, as you can clearly see. What were the practical sciences? Conduct and goodness. How to be how to be an ethical person. Nicomachean ethics is named after his son. Eudemonian ethics and Magna Moralia, which is the great ethics, and of course the book that's most important to us, which is on politics, his book on politics. And finally, the productive sciences included things that were the ability, the craft to create things that were beautiful or useful. So shipbuilding, agriculture, medicine, rhetoric, art, the arts of music, theater, dance, poetics, I think rhetoric is there twice, All of these are considered to be productive sciences. Rhetoric was very important to the Greeks because a man that was eloquent and could make a good argument was considered to be, would have political power and would sway the people, etc. So, Aristotle begins more or less in the same place where Plato leaves off. If you recall from Plato, there were two contending ideas that Plato was looking at. There was a Heraclitean idea and the Parmenidean idea. Heraclitus thought, well, everything is in flux, and this meant that things were always changing, and how could one have knowledge in an ever-changing world? And Parmenides thought that change was an illusion, and he also got into trouble of explaining sense perception itself. How could we explain what we see if everything is illusion, and we see change, then how can we explain that? Well, Plato resolved this one way. He said, in his theory of ideas, his theory of forms, his epistemology, he said the ideal world was without change, but the material world was with change. The material world was based on certain limited number of forms which are ideal. And these ideals themselves were organized in a relationship to each other. And the role of dialectics was to find out these ideals and the relationship of these ideals to each other. So that's where where Aristotle begins. And Aristotle begins by demolishing Plato. His own ustad, dekho kitna na shukra kisam ka banda tha. But apne ustad, he begins by demolishing Plato, and he does a remarkable job of it. First of all, there's many arguments that he comes up with. Let me, here we go. So let's look at these articles very quickly. What were his criticisms of the theory of forms? If we look at them in a little more detail, they were firstly that Plato's ideas do not explain the existence of things. Sure, okay, you say, Mr. Plato, these ideas exist and the material reality exists. But what is it that results in the transformation of these ideas into material reality? I mean, you cannot explain that except by, recourse to the divine, the demiurges, as Plato said. How do you explain that in the material world, man is then born? The idea of man exists, it's a completely immaterial thing. It's a pure idea. How does it come about in reality then, that horses and cats and dogs and so on exist? And Plato utterly fails to do this. Even admitting that, say the idea of whiteness exists, we cannot see how it produces white objects. That remains completely open in Plato. Then he says, Plato does not explain the relation of ideas to things. Things, we are told, are copies of ideas and participate in them. But how are we to understand this participation? In using such phrases, Plato is giving no real account of the relationship, but is merely uttering poetic metaphors. There's no explanation of the relation of ideas to things. Not how things become, ideas become things, what the relation between them, we know nothing about that. Motion is not explained by Plato. If ideas are immutable and the things that we see in matter are in motion, as Plato admits, how does motion happen? Is there an idea of motion? Are the ideas in motion? Plato has no explanation for motion at all. And this is a big contradiction in Plato. Then he says that there are a multitude of things. We know that in the world there are lots and lots of things. We have to explain the lots and lots of things with few things. And all Plato has done is multiplied the things by 2 and said everything that exists also has a form. This is not explaining anything. In fact, it's just doubling the number of things. In fact, multiplying the number of things that require explanation. He says, Plato merely assumes the existence of another multitude of things, the ideas. But the only effect of this is to double the number of things to be explained. How does it help fast to duplicate everything? Plato is like a man who, being unable to count with a small number, fancies that if he doubles the number, he will find it easier to count. So he's just doubled the number of things that have to be explained. He hasn't explained anything. Then he says, ideas are sensuous. Plato thought that a non-sensuous principle must be sought in order to explain the world of sense. But not being able to find any such principle, he merely took the objects of sense over again and called them non-sensuous. There is no difference between the horse and the idea of the horse, except the useless and meaningless in itself or in general attached to each object of sense to make it appear something different. So the horse in general What is that? What does that even mean? It means nothing. The idea of the horse is the horse is the idea of the horse, and so on. Ideas are nothing but hypothesized things of sense, no different from the anthropomorphic gods of popular religion. Just as gods are nothing but deified men, like Zeus and Apollo and Atlas and so on, there's deified men, he says, and so these ideas are nothing but externalized things of nature. Things are said to be copies of ideas, but in fact ideas are only copies of things. So he's not moving us any further. And one of his strongest arguments is called the third man argument, in which he says, whenever you see two ideas, like a white ball, there's the idea of whiteness and the idea of the ball, well, they combine in some way to create a white ball, right? Or a red ball, whatever it may be. Well, if these two ideas combine, then there must be a third idea that explains how the two combine and what proportion they combine, why they combine, and so on. So this is the third idea now that has to be generated in order to explain the bloody white ball, which was one idea. Now we have a concept of whiteness and a concept of the ball and how they match together. This is yet another idea that we have to explain. So there is a common element in all men, therefore there is an idea of man, but there is also an element common to the individual man and to the idea of man. There must therefore be a further idea, the third man, to explain this. And between these further ideas in the individual man, there must be yet another idea to explain that they have in common, and so on ad infinitum. So I'm a man, you're a man, right? But you're also a man, so there has to be one idea that explains the connection between you and me and the difference between you and me, yet another idea that explains the connection and difference between you and him, yet another idea that explains the connection between you and me and the difference between you and me. Oh my God, there are so many ideas to explain. It's just multiplying everything and creating complete confusion. Koi cheez Plato explain karne mein kamyab nahi hua. And finally, he concludes that essences cannot be outside of things. They have to be in those things. Ideas are the essences of things, and yet these essences are outside of things themselves. How is this possible? The essence of the thing must be in it, he says. The idea as the universal can only exist in the particular. The universal is not something that exists by itself and independently of the individual laws. There is no such thing as whiteness that exists outside of white objects. Anytime you think of white, you're thinking of an object that's white. You can never not think of an object which is white. Or you're thinking of white light, or you're thinking of a white plane, or something like that, right? You cannot but think of things in their particular formation. Plato was led into the absurdity of talking as if beside the individual horse we know there is somewhere another individual called the horse in general, or as if besides white objects there is a thing called whiteness. And this is in fact the supreme self-contradiction of whiteness. And it begins by saying that the universal is real and the particular is unreal. Universal se matlab hai the general idea is real and the particular is unreal. Whereas in fact it's the opposite which is the case. It's the particular which is real, we see it, we can touch it, we can feel it, it's there in front of our senses, etc. And the universal is something that we derive from the examination of particular objects. So we look at a lot of horses and we say, these particular animals have some properties in common, I'm going to call this a horse. That's what's going on, he says. It's not that there's a concept of horse sitting somewhere in the sky and then you remember it because you had some recollection of it in some past life. He says, no. You look at a lot of animals and then you say, okay, these animals walk on 4 legs and these animals walk on 2 legs. So first of all, let's divide these. Then you say, okay, these animals have furry skin and these animals have dry skin, so you divide them. Then you discover these animals are warm-blooded and these are cold. So you keep dividing and dividing and dividing, and that's how you create categories. And this is a social process, a process of observation and a process of division and classification that we are undertaking. It's not some abstract idea that's coming to us from up on high. So basically, Plato is making a mistake of saying that existence is unreal, and what is actually real, he's saying is unreal, and what is nothing but an abstraction of the real, he is saying is real. So he's stood everything on its head. So what is Mr. Aristotle going to do now? Well, he is going to bring things back to the way they should be. Yes?
So all of these arguments actually make sense, but what was that about motion, the third point?
Motion,
what kind of motion?
Very simple. Okay, idea static है, दुनिया के अंदर मोशन है, चेंज है, हर वक्त तब्दीली है. कैसे? if there's an idea, is there an idea of change? जिसकी वजह से दुनिया के अंदर तब्दीली है. How can you explain change? If the ideas are static, why do things change? There's no explanation, right? So either या तो change इस वजह से हो रहा है कि वो ideas भी change हो रहे हैं, तो फिर ये भी change हो रहा है, तो that makes sense because they're sort of mirroring each other. But if the ideas are static, then why are these things changing down here? What's going on? There's no explanation according to Plato.
Sir?
Yes.
Plato says that because the ideal world is all good, the evil in a real world is because of change, and this change comes because the real world doesn't matter, and the ideal world doesn't.
Sure, but there's no explanation then, right? I mean, that's not an explanation. To just say it's evil doesn't give us an explanation of how does it occur. If everything in this world is related to an idea, where is the idea of change? Is there an idea of change? And if there's an idea of change, then if there's no idea of change, then how does change come about? And if there is an idea of change, or if ideas themselves are changing, then that's completely left open.
All the particular things are basically derivations of things in the ideal world, and because the ideal world is static, it is impossible that its derivations will be moving.
Exactly right. Exactly. How is it that if in the ideal world everything is static, in the real world everything is changing? How does that happen? You can create some theory out of it, but Plato has no theory, no explanation. Right? Yes.
But sir, then again, Plato also says that the things that exist in this world are some forms of the idea that exist in the truth. So, can't you say that the things that exist in this world are in motion because they're trying to achieve the static self of complete definity?
You can say that, certainly, but you still have not explained how is it that motion is possible if everything is based on a static idea.
As we said during the Plato lectures, that things that exist in the world aren't completely exact copies of what exists
Why?
out there. So because everything is not the same here.
Why? Plato can't explain it, you see.
Yeah.
Why is it not the same, bhai? You'll say, oh, there's another idea which says, how an ideal thing, when it comes into this thing, is slightly different from that thing. वो तो फिर पता नहीं आपने multitude of more ideas बना दिए. ठीक है ना? So if you go one step further and you start asking more why questions, Plato's stuck. Yes.
Sir, but he said, Plato said that that idea is not very specific. That is
it's a general idea.
General form.
Yeah.
Right? Then how can Aristotle expect him to explain how is the specific?
So that's the question that Plato has to answer, not Aristotle. If there's a general idea, but there's a specific form for every woman, how does the general transform into the specific? How does the universal become a particular? Right? So let's say there are women that are African American, without any intention of being racist here, say that they are black in the color of their skin, and there are others that are yellow. There's another idea that's participating in them. So how does that relationship even occur? It's stuck. And then how do they live or die? How does change occur? If the idea for women is static, why do actual women live and die? Right? Plato has no explanation. And you cannot derive an explanation from it, is what Aristotle is asking. And so he's got these 6-7 criticisms of Plato, which are quite interesting. Yes?
Was all of this during Plato's lifetime?
Yeah, he started developing this during Plato's lifetime. And then, of course, he elaborated it after Plato's death as well.
Sir, can we call him an empiricist? And
we're going to come to that just a bit. We can come to that just a bit. But certainly empiricism is derived from many of the ideas of Aristotle. That's quite correct to say. It's not that you can call Aristotle purely an empiricist, because there are many ideas in Aristotle that you will see are not in line with empiricism, as we understand empiricism of the Humean and Lockean and the Bishop Berkeley and all of those guys. So, but certainly many of their ideas are influenced in turn by Aristotle, and induction in particular is deeply influenced by Aristotle. More questions? So, धज्जियां उड़ा दी यार प्लेटो की. Oh my God! इतना मजा आया था मैं पिछले वीक सर आपने ये क्या किया है. पहले आपने एक बंदे को इतना खड़ा किया, फिर इसी को पटक के मार दिया उल्टा. ये तो बड़ी ज्यादती की है आपने, इतना बड़ा philosopher. Well, that happens in philosophy, and it started happening within Plato's lifetime. So, properties that are eternal, the forms have eternal properties, eternal, they're unchanging, they're transcendent. But this is incompatible with the material objects that they create, which are changing temporal, their material. They have no explanation. The resemblance between objects and form must also be explained in terms of another form. What form does an object and the form both copy to account for the similarity or dissimilarity? This leads to an infinite regress, negating the notion that forms are few. Plato, ये बहुत emphasis था that he's going to explain a lot of things with a few forms, right? All of man is sort of, all of humanity he can put under the category of human in the abstract. But now he has to, if there are 6 billion human beings, then he has to have, 6 billion factorial to explain all the differences between them. If you know your math. Where's the mathematician? Am I right? Is it 6 million factorial? To explain all the dissimilarities and similarities between them, bloody hell. It would probably be 2 into 6 million factorial, which is insane. So you can't do that. It just negates the purpose that Plato has set out to accomplish, which was to explain a lot of things with a few factors. So, now what he's going to do is he's going to put Plato on his head. उल्टा कर देगा Plato को. पहले इस तरह था, उसको दिशा पे कर देगा. कैसे? Well, not physically, this is just a joke. But he says, in fact, Plato is wrong to say that senses give us inaccurate information. Senses, in fact, give us accurate information about reality, even when we see the bent oar. या चप्पू जब आप पानी में डालते हैं तो आपको नजर आता है कि चप्पू टेढ़ा हो गया है, तो असल में तो चप्पू टेढ़ा नहीं है. तो the information जब आप पानी से निकालते हैं आप देखते हो तो सीधा पानी में डालते हो टेढ़ा हो गया. तो but is that information wrong? Aristotle says no, it's not wrong information. It's still telling you something about reality which is accurate. What is it telling you about reality which is accurate? Exactly, that light refracts. When it goes through a thicker or a more dense medium, it refracts. That's what it's telling you. It bends, right? It turns. So, fascinating, right? So, actually, the bent oar is giving you accurate information. That light is passing through 2 different mediums, and hence, what you're seeing in the air medium is going like this, and what you're seeing in the water medium is going like that. So, it's not incorrect information. It's correct information. But you need to know how to interpret it correctly, how to understand it correctly. So then he says, so first of all he says, the senses are not giving you inaccurate information. They're giving you accurate information, you just need to know how to understand it, baby. Okay? The idea of horse, says Aristotle, you complicated things so much. Dude, it's very simple, he said in his American accent. He said, like the idea of a horse was like simply a concept that like we humans had formed like after seeing a certain number of like horses. He didn't say it like that. We saw a number of animals, we saw a number of horses, we said, this animal looks the same as this animal, which looks the same as this animal. You know what I'm going to call it? I'm going to call it a horse. It's really that simple. By form, the form of a horse, Aristotle meant that which is common to all horses. You have to have certain properties that are common to be called a horse, or to be called a man, or a woman, or a cat, or a dog. Forms were in the things because they were the particular characteristics of those things. So you should not be looking for the essence in some sky in the high, sky in the pie in the sky, sorry. You should be looking for the forms in the particular objects themselves. The properties that are common is what the forms are. The real objects in the form of the objects are just as inseparable as body and soul, he says. So, Aristotle says, perception starts with the eye. Senses are the basis of knowledge. Things that are in the human soul are purely reflections of natural objects. By the soul over here, he doesn't mean the religious concept of the soul. He means, because in ancient Greek philosophy, they often use the terms, and in all philosophy, they often use the term soul to also mean. Okay, so the things that are in the mind, you should read the sentence like, the things that are in the mind, जो हमारे ज़हन में ख्याल है, are purely reflections of the natural objects. I look at something, I look at that bag, and in my mind, I form an image, a picture of that bag. Nature is the real world, he says. The world of matter is the real world, not the world of ideas, as Plato said. Nothing exists in consciousness that has not first been experienced by the senses. Wow. Can you think, this is a fascinating thought experiment, can you think of an alien which is so weird that it is utterly unrelatable to anything you've seen or heard or as a human being. Can you think of something that you have never seen? Not in the sense, of course you can think of something you haven't seen. I can think of a three-legged or three-winged fairy. I've never seen one, right? My point is, those are amalgams of various things we have seen. Like a dolphin is an amalgam of a woman and sorry, not a dolphin, a mermaid. I keep getting this confused. Even with my kids, with Zara and Zoe, I say, oh, you want a dolphin? They're like, yeah, no, I want a mermaid. is a combination of a woman and a fish, right? So we can make various combinations and permutations of, even when we do aliens, like, those big bad scary monsters in that film with, the alien series, right? Prometheus and all this stuff, right? Where the alien comes and then he fights and the woman finally wins, etc., and all that stuff. So even the aliens are just different combinations of animals we've seen in our own imagination. We just put them together differently. We say, iska naak yahan kar denge, iski aankhein yahan kar denge, iska skull yun kar denge, vagaira, vagaira, iske claws yun kar lenge. Our imagination is based on what we've experienced. It's like asking, and this is a sad but important thing. Could a blind person understand what color is? Imagine what color is. It's difficult. Born blind, to imagine color. It's difficult if you've never seen it. A person who's born deaf, could they imagine what music is? It would be difficult, right? So it's from the senses that our minds develop various ideas. Yes?
Sir, but that doesn't explain, for instance, technological innovation.
Why?
Because, how did the first wheel form then?
Why is that hard to explain?
According to this theory?
Yeah.
Because people couldn't imagine it back then.
It doesn't mean that, it means that what they imagine are things that they have seen in what Aristotle means is that the raw material of imagination is provided from our senses. That's what he means. We put that raw material together in different ways to come up with new ideas and new things and inventions and so on. We can't invent something of which does not come out of some experience of ours. एक खूबसूरत सही है ना, necessity is the mother of invention. We invented things because we were doing things. What were we doing when we invented the wheel? We were trying to transport things, right? How were we transporting things in the ancient world? Heavy things, like logs and so on. Well, we laid the logs down and we rolled them. That's how, when we cut down the trees, we laid them down and we rolled them. And then we started rolling on things on top of the rolling logs. And then we said, well, this is pretty cool. Let me cut the log out. So, you cut the logs to roll things, like, for example, the Egyptians. How did they get those massive stones moving? Yeah, those massive stones with which they built the pyramids. How did they move them? They moved them on logs. Yeah, they used to take the stone, they used to take a lever, pull it up, roll a log under it, push from piche, and they would get it on top of the logs, and then they would roll the logs. But two slaves would come and put another log, and then another log, and then another log, पीछे से उठाते जाते थे, आगे से उठाते जाते थे, और इस तरह करके वो roll करते रहते थे. So that is really the origin, and so then they developed that further. They said, all right, how can we get this log to be rolling without, not as a full log, but put something on top of it, So then they came up with a round wheel with just a spoke in it. Then they came up with wheels with spokes, etc., and so on. That's how they developed it. कुछ ज़रूरत थी तो उसकी वजह से फिर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता चीज़ें develop. Okay, the mind has the innate faculty of organizing all sensory impressions into categories and classes. So when you look at things, you want to organize them. You want to understand them. To understand them, you have to organize them. So you start to say, if I look at so many different things, everything I look at is different. There are no two exactly similar objects in the world. So to help me to help me to utilize that information, mankind started to create general ideas like horses. So I wouldn't have to say, if I had named every single horse, given every single horse a name, and if I had to tell you, find me more horses, I'd be very, very hard done. I'd say, find me somebody like, let's say I named one of my horses Tony. Find me an animal like Tony. He says, but there is no animal like Tony. No, it can be an animal like Tony, or it can be an animal like Mona, which is the second horse, and the third horse, and the fifth horse, and the sixth horse. I'd have to tell you all the name of the horses and say, find me something that looks like all of them. Finally, you would say, you mean find me a horse? I'm like, yes, find me a horse. Thank you. We'll call these animals, we'll call them horses. It made things easier to communicate, to understand, and so on. So that's the idea. So the mind, when it organizes information, it gets. This is a process that we undertake. It's a social process. It's a process that is undertaken not by something that exists in the abstract, but by your own intellect, says Aristotle. When you see things, when you hear things, when you touch things, when you taste things, when you feel things, when you hear things, you get all this sensory data, and then you start to put it together in some way. So, what is substance and form? Well, Aristotle says substance you can think of as something, whatever everything is created out of is, let's say, substance. It changes, it's Heraclitean. And the essence is what we turn that substance into. Like we have we have clay, and then we can mold that clay into a pot. The clay is a substance. The pot is the form that the clay becomes. So in this way, we can see that there is some value in understanding form and substance, or the difference. You can create a pot out of a different substance. You can create a bronze pot, or an iron pot, or a clay pot, right? So the substance here is varying, but the form is the same, essentially. Right? So that's the difference. That's the real difference, he says, between substance and form. And how does substance take form? How does it become something? What's the process through which things become other things? Well, first you have the material cause. The material cause, he says, is the raw material, right? Nature, earth, clay, whatever. Then you have the formal cause. The formal cause is the form that you want it to turn into. So it's the plan, as you can see. It's the plan. Then you have the efficient cause, which is whoever puts this together into this, puts the form into the clay, is the efficient cause, i.e. the person doing the work, whether it's a person or nature or God or whatever. But this is the efficient cause, which is making things move. It's the, you can also say it's the external cause, because form and substance aren't going to put themselves come together themselves. Somebody is putting them together. Some force is putting them together. And that's basically the efficient cause. And then there's the final word, which is what it wants to become. What is it that it is going towards? What is its teleology? What is teleology? Teleology is a very particular way of understanding the world. It is that everything is changing, but everything is changing towards some goal which is going to be unchanging. Some unchanging goal. Everything, in other words, to put it very simply, is trying to move towards its perfect form. So, for example, you plant a tree, you plant a seed, and slowly the seed becomes a full-grown tree, right? It's that full-grown tree which is the essence of the seed, which defines the seed. And this is a superb way for Aristotle to, in fact, distinguish between different seeds. So you may have one seed, or not just seeds, but to classify things. So he wants to classify things not just by looking at the state they are in presently, but the state they want to achieve, or the state that they are going to achieve. And that, he says, it helps me classify not only seeds, but people, and states, and politics, and ethics, and so many other things. What's the end goal here? What's the final goal? The world is coming to an end, but what are your goals? That's what is important. He says the goals define, the teleology defines what that means. Yes?
How do we define the perfect form and the perfect goal, or the end goal? I mean, how
Yeah, the end goal, the end of that thing is the perfect form, right? So that's the form it's trying to achieve. It's its most complex and developed form. That's what Aristotle would say. And that's the final cause. The final cause, the essence, is the essence of the object. Hence, essence is not in the ideal world, but within the thing itself. It's like a seed that becomes something big. And that's what that helps us categorize and describe what that thing is. Now, in the world today, and in scientific discourse today, we no longer think in terms of teleology. In fact, we consider teleological arguments themselves to be very, very unscientific. Because you can get a teleology where you say food and water are necessary conditions of life, But were food and water created for us? Were they created for life? That ascribes a teleological motive to food and water, but that teleological motive, according to modern science, does not really exist. Were mice made so that cats could live? Were cats made so that dogs could eat them? Well, dogs don't eat cats, but you get the point, right? They weren't made for this purpose. But understanding the purpose of something, says Aristotle, helps us categorize it. So that's teleology. What's the purpose of life? What's the teleology of life? What's the purpose of society? What's the teleology of society? What's the purpose of history? So religion is also a teleology in that sense, right? The purpose of life, according to religious teleology, is to be a good person and to go to heaven. Am I right? Is the day of, according to, let's say, the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, is to, there are many, many religions in the world, but according to our religion, or I assume our religion, there may be people of different religions in this classroom, but that's the end goal of existence, is Akhirat is the end goal of existence. That's what describes life. So that's a particular religious teleology, but there can be other teleologies as well. Everything has a, to put it very briefly, everything has a purpose. The purpose defines that. That's teleology. Now, the very opposite of teleology is the end goal, the purpose, right? The final stage. The very opposite of that is the first cause. What is the first cause? Well, Aristotle says, if the end of something is the teleology, if you move backwards and backwards and backwards, you have to keep going backwards. And he gives a metaphor which is very physical. So say, for example, whatever I move, I have to be more stationary than whatever it is that I move. Very common physical thing, right? If I push something, I have to be more stationary than what I am pushing in order for that object to move and for me to stand still. Am I right? So for example, if I'm on wheels and I try to push the car, what will happen is that I will go backwards. If I'm on skates, roller skates, I'll start going backwards unless the skates are sideways or something, right? I'll go backwards. So that means that the car is more stationary than I am. It has more inertia than I am. I move. When a force is applied between us to separate us, the car doesn't move, I move. It's more stationary than I am. But if I have my feet firmly planted on the thing and I push hard and the handbrake isn't on and somebody isn't pressing the brake and saying, push harder, then the car will probably move forward, which I did with a lot of my friends. धक्का लगा जोर से ब्रेक लगाई इंसान. क्या कर रहा है यार जान नहीं तेरे में. Yes.
So we're talking about like causal argument, right? So the problem that's very famous about causal argument is you go to infinity, you made a rule that everything must have a cause, but then you stop at uncaused cause. Like why do you stop there?
Yeah, so I'm coming to that. I'm coming exactly to that. So if every cause, now I'm pushing the car is moving, that's the effect, I'm the cause, that's the effect. If I were less stationary than the car, right, if I had less inertia than the car, then I would move, I'd become the cause, and the car would become the effect. So for the cause has to have greater inertia than the effect. Now if you keep going back in terms of cause and effect, whoever is doing you keep going back, you're going back in terms of inertia. You're going back in terms of movement, in terms of change. So you finally end up with a cause which is unmoved. And cannot be moved. You take an infinite regress. You go back to, think of it in terms of momentum and motion, right? Everything has momentum in the world, right? So if we keep going back in everything with greater momentum can push something with less momentum. Am I right? Can move something with less momentum. Momentum is what? Force into speed or whatever, right? So, no, sorry, mass into speed, right? So, am I right?
Yeah.
Mass into speed, right?
Mass into velocity.
Yes. Yeah, break, people. I'm trying to make it simple for you. Okay, mass into velocity, mass, which is the same as saying mass into speed. But anyway, so something with greater momentum can move something with less momentum. So, for example, when I take a billiard ball and I go and I break the rack, why does that happen? It happens because although the two balls have the same mass, the momentum of the ball that I'm hitting is much greater because it's moving fast, correct? Or if I could take a very big, heavy ball, made of platinum or something, and just tip it, and you can be assured that it would move all the balls because it would have such great mass in it that it would move it. And if I take a ping pong ball and I hit, I hit a rack of billiard balls, what's going to happen? Those billiard balls will not move. The ping pong ball will go ding. It will fly off, right? Because it does not have the necessary momentum to move those other balls. So if you go back in terms of cause and effect, every cause must have greater momentum than the effect. So you keep going backwards, you go to greater and greater inertia, and you end up, if you do an infinite regress in this way, you end up with the unmoved mover, the cause which no other cause can move. It has such enormous mass and momentum, or rather it has such enormous inertia that it cannot be moved by any other object, but it can move all other objects. So think of the universe in terms of all the spinning planets and the spinning stars and the spinning galaxies, and think of think of all of that as momentum, right? Aristotle wasn't thinking in this way because he couldn't have known how large and amazing the galaxy is, because of course the telescope and other things were invented much, much later in history. But just for our sakes, imagine, everything is a whirling ball going forwards and backwards. And you've set things into motion, into momentum, like वो जो टिक 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 करके चीज़ चलती है, या आपने कभी कोई बम्बीरी घुमाई होगी इतना करके, या कोई यो-यो किया होगा वगैरह, right? So you're putting things into motion, and you're more powerful than the things that you put into motion. So you go backwards. What you come to the prime mover, to the uncaused cause, the cause which causes all the other causes are down to infinity, which gets the whole world moving. And this Aristotle also calls God. This is God, because it's the unmoved prime mover, the first cause. But this is a very different God from religion, because this is a sort of God which is it's a sort of a how should I put it? It's sort of it's not a thinking anthropomorphic sort of God which is rewarding you for good behavior and bad behavior. It's more of a force, a natural force, than a force of nature that puts everything into motion, rather than a religious conception of God, which is very anthropomorphic. What do I mean by anthropomorphic? Very much human in one sense. God is not human, but in one sense, in the sense of God thinks and acts and speaks and so on, right? So this is not that sort of conception at all. So Aristotle's unmoved mover is eternal, intelligent, and non-material. This is pure form thinking about itself. This is actuality without potentiality. This is perfection. This is God. But not a God that intervenes in the affairs of nature, which always follows a natural course. This is a God unmoved by both earthly and cosmic events. It's not a God that says, I must intervene in Jange Badar and save my people, obviously. This is like a force of nature more than an intervening God. Okay? So, and you can see how natural scientists who tend towards atheism like this kind of conception of God rather than a religious conception of God. This is like a force of nature rather than an intervening God. Okay. Now, to Aristotle's, should we take a 5-minute break? Yes. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. I'll start at 1 exactly, okay?
Should I stop recording? Ask him.
Ask me other people.
क्या मतलब है? फंस गई मैंने.
I love the way everybody said yes.
So should I stop recording and then start?
Yeah, don't record the